Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, page 461. Part of Don Gaitley's live-in staff job is that he hurtles here and there on selected Ennet House errands. He cooks the communal supper on weekdays, which means he does the house's weekly shopping, which means that at least a couple of times a week, he gets to take Pat Montesian's black 1964 Ford Aventura and drive to the Purity Supreme Market. The Aventura is an antique variant of the Mustang, the sort of car you usually only see waxed and static in car shows, with somebody in a bikini pointing at it. Pat's is functional and mint reconditioned. Her shadowy husband, with something like 10 years sober, being big into cars. With such a wicked nice multi-layer paint job that it's black as the bottomless quality of water at night. It has 2 different alarm systems and a red metal bar you're supposed to lock across the steering wheel when you get out. The engine sounds more like a jet engine than a piston engine. Plus, there's a scoop poking periscopically from the hood. And for Gaitley, the vehicle's so terrifically tight and sleek it's like being strapped into a missile and launched at the sight of a domestic errand. He can barely fit in the driver's seat. The steering wheel is about the size of an old video arcade game steering wheel, and the thin canted 6-speed shift is encased in a red leather baglet that smells strongly of leather. The height of the car's roof compromises Gaitley's driving posture, and his right ham, exceeds the seat and squeezes against the gear shift, so that shifting pinches his hip. He does not care. Some of the profoundest spiritual feelings of his sobriety so far are for this car. He'd drive this car if the driver's seat was just a sharp, pointy spike, he told Johnette Foltz. Johnette Foltz is the other live-in staffer, though between ultra-rabid commitment activity in NA and a somehow damaged NA fiancé, she spends a lot of time pushing around places in a wicker wheelchair. She's around Ennet House less and less now, and there are rumblings about a possible replacement, which Gaitley and the heterosexual male residents pray daily will be a leggy alumna and part-time counselor, Danielle Steenbach, who's rumored also to attend Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, which engages everyone's imagination to the max. It's a mark of serious regard and questionable judgment that director Pat M. lets Don Gaitley drive her priceless Aventura, even just to the Metro Food Bank or Purity Supreme, because Gaitley lost his license more or less permanently back in the year of the Whisper Quiet Maytag dishwasher for getting pinched on a DUI in Peabody on a license that had already been suspended for a previous DUI in Lowell. This was not the only loss Don Gaitley incurred as his chemical careers moved toward their life-reversing climax. Once every couple months now, still, he has to put on his brown dress slacks and slightly irregular green sport coat from Brighton Budget Large and Tall Menswear and take the commuter rail up to selected district court venues on the North Shore and meet with his various PDs and POs and caseworkers, and sometimes appear briefly up in front of judges and review boards to review the progress of his sobriety and reparations. When he first came to Ennet House last year, Gaitley had bad check and forgery issues. He had a malicious destruction of property issue, plus 2 D&Ds and a bullshit public urination out of Tewksbury. He had a break and enter from a silent alarm Peabody mansion where he and a colleague got pinched, before anything could get promoted. He had a possession with intent from 38 50-milligram tablets of Demerol in a Pez container, which he'd shoved down into the crack of Peabody's finest cruiser's back seat, but which got found anyway on the routine post-transport cruiser search all cops perform when the arrestee's pupils are unresponsive both to light and to head slaps. There was, too, of course, a certain darker issue, vis-a-vis a certain upscale Brookline home, whose late owner had been eulogized at terrifying length and headline size in both the Globe and Herald. After 8 months of indescribable psychic cringing, waiting for the legal footwear to drop on the Nuck VIP issue, toward the end of his drug use, Gaitley had gotten sloppy and crazy and stuck, idiotically, with a method of straight meter shunting that he'd learned up at MCI Billerica, and was pretty sure now constituted a signature Gaitley M.O., since the older guy that taught it to him in the Billerica metal shop had subsequently got out and gone to Utah and died of a morphine overdose. And who on earth hopes to get reliable morphine in fucking Utah? Over 2 years ago, after 8 months of cringing and nail-biting, the last couple of months of the torment in Ennett House, even though the house's DSAS license put it legally off limits to all constabulary without Pat Montesian's physical presence and notarized permission, after he was down to the cuticles on all 10 digits, Gaitley had very discreetly approached a certain Percodan-devoted court stenographer an old girlfriend had once dealt to, and had the guy make equally discreet inquiries, and found that the potential murder 2 investigation of the botched burglary had been taken over, paced the loud howls of a certain remorseless Revere ADA, by something federal the adult stenographer called Non-Specific Services Bureau, whereupon the case vanished from any sort of investigative scene the stenographer could make inquiries about. Though quiet rumor had it that current suspicions were being directed at a certain shadowy knucko-political body all the way up in Quebec, far north of the Enfield M.A., where Gaitley had been cringing his way to nightly AA meetings with his fingers in his mouth. Most of the cases Gaitley had pending in his PD had gotten closed without finding, contingent on Gaitley's entering long-term treatment and maintaining chemical abstinence and submitting to random urinalysis, and making bi-weekly reparation payments out of the pathetic paychecks he earned cleaning shit and sperm under Stavros Lobokoulas, and now also cooking and live-in staffing at Ennett House. The only issue not resolved on a blue file deferral was the business of driving with a DUI suspended license. In the Commonwealth of MA, this issue carries a mandatory 90-day bid, as in the penalties written right into the statute. And the case's PD has been upfront with Gaitley about it. It's only a matter of time, of the wheel's slow judicial grind, before some judge red files the issue and the case, and Gaitley has to do the bid at some place MCI minimum like Concord or Deer Island. Gaitley isn't too hinked about 90 inside. At 24, he'd done 17 months at Billerica for assaulting 2 bouncers in a nightclub. It was more like he'd beaten the second bouncer bloody with the unconscious body of the first. And he knew quite well he could get by in a Commonwealth lockdown. He was too big to fuck or fuck with, and not interested in fucking with anyone else. He did his time stand up and gave nobody any provoking cause. And when the first couple of hard guys had come after him for his canteen cigarettes, he'd laugh it off with ferocious jolliness. And when they came back a second time, Gaitley beat them half to death in the corridor behind the weight room, where he could be sure plenty of other guys could hear it. And after that one incident was out of the way, he could simply get by and not get fucked with. Gaitley now was hinked only about the prospect of getting just 1 or 2 AA meetings a week in jail. The only meetings sober inmates get are when an area group comes in on an institutional commitment, which Gaitley's been on, when Demerol and Talwen and good old weed are almost easier to get in jail than in the outside world. Gaitley cringed now only at the thought of the sergeant at arms, the distinguished-looking shepherd guy. Going back to ingesting substances had become his biggest fear. Even Gaitley can tell this is a major psychic turnaround. He tells the newer residents right up front that AA's somehow gotten him by the mental curlies. He'll now go to literally any lengths to stay clean. He'll tell them right out that he'd first come to Ennet House only to keep out of jail and hadn't had much interest or hope about actually staying clean for any length of time. And he'd been upfront with Pat Montesian about this during his application interview. The grim honesty about his disinterest and hopelessness was one reason Pat even let such a clearly bad news specimen into the house on nothing but a lukewarm referral from a PO up at the 5th District in Peabody. Pat told Gaitley that grim honesty and hopelessness were the only things you need to start recovering from substance addiction, but that without these qualities you were totally up the creek. Desperation helped also, she said. Gaitley scratched at her dog's stomach and said he wasn't sure if he was desperate about anything, except wanting to somehow stop getting in trouble for things he usually afterward couldn't even remember he did. The dog trembled and shuddered, and its eyes rolled up as Gaitley, who hadn't been told about Pat's thing about wanting her dogs petted, rubbed its scabby stomach. Pat had said, well, that was enough, that desire for the shitstorm to end. Gaitley said her dog sure did like having its stomach rubbed, and Pat explained that the dog was epileptic, and said that just a desire to stop blacking out was more than enough to start with. She pulled some Commonwealth substance abuse study in a black plastic binder off a long black plastic bookshelf filled with black plastic binders. It turned out Pat Montesian liked the color black a lot. She was dressed, really kind of overdressed, for a halfway house, in black leather pants and a black shirt of silk or something silky. Outside the bay window, a green line train was laboring up the first Enfield Hill in the late summer rain. The downhill view from the bay window over Pat's black lacquer or enamelish desk was like the only spectacular thing about Ennet House, which was otherwise a wicked, awful dump. Pat made a sound against the binder with a svelte nail extension and said that in this state study right here, conducted at the year of the Tux-medicated pad, over 60% of the inmates serving life sentences in hellish MCI Wadpole, and not disputing that they'd done what they'd done to get in there, nevertheless had no memory of having done it. Whatever got them in there for life? None. Gaitley had to have her run it by him a couple of times before he isolated her point. They'd been in blackouts. Pat said a blackout was where you continued to function, sometimes disastrously, but weren't aware later of what you did. It's like your mind wasn't in possession of your body, and it was usually brought on by alcohol, but could also be brought on by chronic use of other substances, synthetic narcotics among them. Gaitley said he couldn't recall ever having a real blackout, and Pat M. got it, but didn't laugh. The dog was heaving and quivering with its legs spronged out to all points of the compass and kind of spasming, and Gaitley didn't know whether to quit rubbing on it. To be honest, He didn't know what epilepsy was, but suspected Pat was not referring to the woman's leg shaver thing his totally alcoholic past girlfriend, Pamela Hoffman Jeep, used to scream in the bathroom when she used. Everything mental for Gaitley was kind of befogged and prone to misprision for well into his first year clean. Pat Montesian was both pretty and not. She was in maybe her late 30s. She'd supposedly been this young and pretty and wealthy socialite out on the Cape until her husband had divorced her for being a nearly full-blown alcoholic, which seemed like abandonment and didn't approve her subsequent drinking one jot. She'd been in and out of rehabs and halfway places in her 20s, but then it wasn't until she'd almost died from a stroke during the DT's 1 a.m. that she'd been able to surrender and come in with the requisite hopeless desperation, etc. Gaitley didn't wince when he heard about Pat's stroke, because his mom hadn't had DTs or a classic stroke, but rather a cirrhotic hemorrhage that made her choke and deprived her brain of oxygen and had irreparably vegetabilized her brain. The two cases were totally apart in his mind. Pat M. was never in any way a mother figure for Gaitley. Pat liked to smile and say when residents pissed and moaned about their own addictions. During the weekly house community meeting, she'd nod and smile and say that for her the stroke had been far and away the best thing that's ever happened to her because it enabled her to finally surrender. She'd come to Enid House in an electric wheelchair at 32 and been unable to communicate except via Morse code blinks or something for the first 6 months, but had even, without use of her arms, demonstrated a willingness to try and eat a rock when the founding guy who didn't even use his first name told her to, using her torso and neck to chop downwardly at the rock and chipping both incisors. You can still see the caps at the corners. And had gotten sober and remarried a different and older South Shore-like trillionaire with what sounded like psychotic kids, but regained an unexpected amount of function and had been working at the house ever since. The right side of her face was still pulled away over in this sort of rictus, and her speech took Gaitley some getting used to. It sounded like she was still loaded all the time, a kind of over-enunciated slurring. The half of her face that wasn't rictusized was very pretty, and she had very long, pretty red hair and a sexually credible body, even though her right arm had atrophied into a kind of semi-claw, and the right hand was strapped into this black plastic brace to keep its nail-extensioned fingers from curling into her palm. And Pat walked with a dignified but god-awful lurch, dragging a terribly thin right leg in black leather pants behind her, like something hanging on to her that she was trying to get away from. During his residency, she'd gone personally with Gaitley on most of his bigger court dates, driving him up to the North Shore in the killer Aventura with its handicapped plates. She, because of the neurological right leg thing, literally had a lead foot and drove all the time like a maniac. And Gaitley had usually almost wet himself on Route 1. And she'd throw all Enid House's substantial respect and clout behind him with judges and boards until every issue that could be resolved without finding was blue-filed. Gaitley still couldn't figure out why all the personal extra attention and help. It was like he'd been Pat M's biggest favorite among the residents last year. She did have favorites and non-favorites. It was probably unavoidable. Annie Parrott and the counselors and house manager always had their particular favorites too, so it all tended to work out square. About 4 months into his Enid House residency, the agonizing desire to ingest synthetic narcotics had been mysteriously, magically removed from Don Gaitley. Just like the house staff and the crocodiles at the White Flag group had said it would, if he pounded out the nightly meetings. and stayed minimally open and willing to persistently ask some extremely vague higher power to remove it. The desire. They said to get creakily down on his mammoth knees in the AM every day and ask God, as he understood him, to remove the agonizing desire, and to hit the old knees again at night before sack, and thank this goddish figure for the substanceless day just ended, if he got through it. They suggested he keep his shoes and keys under his bed to help him remember to get on his knees. The only times Gaitley had ever been on his knees before were to throw up, or mate, or shunt a low-on-the-wall alarm, or if somebody got lucky during a beef, and landed one near Gaitley's groin. He didn't have any God or JC background, and the knee stuff seemed like the limpest kind of dickless pap, and he felt like a true hypocrite, just going through all the knee motions that he went through faithfully, every AM and PM without fail. Motivated by a desire to get loaded so horrible that he found himself humbly praying for his head to just finally explode already and get it over with. Pat had said it didn't matter at this point what he thought or believed or even said. All that mattered was what he did. If he did the right things and kept doing them for long enough, what Gaitley thought and believed would magically change. Even what he said. She'd seen it happen again and again, and to some awfully unlikely candidates for change. She said it had happened to her. The left side of her face was very alive and kind, and Gaitley's counselor, an ex-coke and phone bunco guy, whose left ear had been one of his losses, had hit Gaitley early on with his infamous Boston AA cake analogy. The grizzled Filipino had met with the resident Don G once a week, driving Gaitley around Brighton Olston in aimless circles in a customized Subaru 4x4, just like the ones Gaitley used to hotwire and promote to use for burgling. Eugenio Martinez had this eccentric thing where he maintained he could only be in touch with his own higher power when he was driving. Down near EWD's barge docks, off the Alston Spur one night, he invited Gaitley to think of Boston AA as a box of Betty Crocker cake mix. Gaitley had smacked himself in the forehead at yet another limp, oblique GM analogy, which Jean had already bludgeoned him with several insectile tropes for thinking about the disease. The counselor had let him vent spleen for a while, smoking as he crawled along behind land barges lined up to unload. He told Gaitley to just imagine for a second that he's holding a box of Betty Crocker cake mix, which represented Boston AA. The box came with directions on the side any 8-year-old could read. Gaitley said he was waiting for the mention of some kind of damn insect inside the cake mix. Jean M. said all Gaitley had to do was, for fuck's sake, give himself a break and relax, and for once shut up and just follow the directions on the side of the fucking box. It didn't matter one fuckola whether Gaitley, believed a cake would result, or whether he understood the, fucking baking chemistry of how a cake would result. If he just followed the motherfucking directions and had sense enough to get help from slightly more experienced bakers to keep from fucking the directions up, if he got confused somehow, but basically, the point was, if he just followed the childish directions, a cake would result. He'd have his cake. The only thing Gaitley knew about cake was that the frosting was the best part, and he personally found Eugenio Martinez a smug and self-righteous prick. Plus, He always distrusted both Orientals and spies. And Jean M. managed to seem like both, but he didn't screw out of the house or quite do anything they could discharge him for, and he went to meetings nightly and told the more or less truth. And he did the shoe under the bed knee thing every AM, PM, 24/7. And he took the suggestion to join a group and get rabidly active and clean up ashtrays and go out speaking on commitments. He had nothing in the way of like God concept, and at that point maybe even less than nothing in terms of interest in the whole thing. He treated prayer like setting an oven temperature according to a box's direction. Thinking of it as talking to the ceiling was somehow preferable to imagine talking to nothing, and he found it embarrassing to get down on his knees in his underwear, and like the other guys in the room, he always pretended his sneakers were like way under the bed, and he had to stay down there a while to find them and get them out when he prayed. But he did it, and beseeched the ceiling and thanked the ceiling, and after maybe 5 months, Gaitley was riding the greenie at 0430 to go clean human turds out of the Shattuck shower, and all of a sudden realized that quite a few days had gone by since he'd even thought about Demerol, or Talwyn, or even weed. Not just merely getting through those last few days, substances hadn't even occurred to him, i.e., the desire and compulsion had been removed. More weeks went by, a blur of commitments and meetings and gasper smoke and cliches, and he still didn't feel anything like his old need to get high. He was in a way free. It was the first time he'd been out of this kind of mental cage since he was maybe 10. He couldn't believe it. He wasn't grateful so much as kind of suspicious about it. The removal. How could some kind of higher power he didn't even believe in magically let him out of the cage when Gaitley had been a total hypocrite in even asking something he didn't believe in to let him out of a cage? He had like zero hope of ever being let out of. When he could only get himself on his knees for the prayers in the first place by pretending to look for his shoes. He couldn't for the goddamn life of him understand how this thing worked. This thing that was working. It drove him bats. At about 7 months, at the Little Sunday Beginners meeting, he actually cracked one of the Providence fake wood tabletops, beating his big square head against it. White flagger Ferocious Francis Gahaney, one of the most ancient and gnarled of the crocodiles, had a white crew cut and scally cap and suspenders over the flannel shirt that encased his gut, and an enormous cucumber-shaped red schnoz you could actually see whole arteries in the skin of, and brown stumpy teeth and emphysema, and a portable little oxygen tank thing whose blue tube was held under the schnoz with white tape, and the very clear, bright eye whites that went along with the extremely low resting pulse rate of a guy with geologic amounts of sober AA time. Ferocious Francis G., whose mouth was never without a toothpick, and who had on his right forearm a faded martini glass and naked lady tattoo of Korean War vintage, who'd gotten sober under the Nixon administration, and who had communicated in the obscene but antiquated epigrams the crocs all used. FF had taken Gaitley out for eye-rattling amounts of coffee after the incident with the table and the head. He listened with the slight boredom of detached identification to Gaitley's complaint that there was no way something he didn't understand enough to even start to believe in was seriously going to be interested in helping save his ass. Even if he, she, it did in some sense exist, Gaitley still doesn't quite know why it helped, but somehow it helped when Ferocious Francis suggested that maybe anything minor league enough for Don Gaitley to understand probably wasn't going to be major league enough to save Gaitley's addled ass from the well-dressed sergeant-at-arms now, was it? That was months ago. Gaitley usually no longer much cares whether he understands or not. He does the knee and ceiling thing twice a day, and cleans shit and listens to dreams and stays active and tells the truth to the Ennet House residents and tries to help a couple of them if they approach him wanting help. And when ferocious Francis G. and the White Flaggers presented him, on the September Sunday that marked his first year sober, with a faultlessly baked and heavily frosted one-candle cake, Don Gaitley had cried in front of non-relatives for the first time in his life. He now denies that he actually did cry, saying something about candle fumes in his eye. But he did. Gaitley is an unlikely choice for Ennet House chef. Having fed for most of the last 12 years on sub-shop subs and corporate snack foods consumed amid some sort of motion, he is 188 centimeters and 128 kilograms and had never once eaten broccoli or a pear until last year. Chef-wise, he offers up an exceptionalist routine of boiled hot dogs, dense, damp meatloaf with little pieces of American cheese, and half a box of cornflakes on top for texture, cream of chicken soup over spirchetti-shaped noodles, ominously dark, leathery, shake-and-bake chicken legs, queasily underdone hamburgers, and hamburger sauce spaghetti, whose pasta he boils for almost an hour. None but the most street-hardened Ennet residents would ever hazard an open crack about the food, which appears nightly at the long dinner table still in the broad steaming pans it was cooked in, with Gaitley's big face hovering lunarly above it, flushed and beaded, under the floppy chef's hat Annie Parrott had given him as a dark joke he hadn't got. His eyes full of anxiety and hopes for everyone's full enjoyment. Basically, looking like a nervous bride serving her first conjugal dish, except this bride's hands are the same size as the house's dinner plates and have jailhouse tats on them, and this bride seems to need no oven mitts as he sets down massive pans on the towels that have been laid down to keep the plastic tabletop from searing. Any sort of culinary comments are always extremely oblique. Randy Lenz, up at the northeast corner, likes to raise his can of tonic and say that Don's food is the kind of food that helps you really appreciate whatever you're drinking along with it. Jeffrey Day talks about what a refreshing change it is to leave a dinner table not feeling bloated. Wade McDade, a young hardcore flask alky from Ashland, Kentucky, and Dooney Glynn, who's still woozy and infirm from some horrendous workers' comp scam gone awry last year, and is constantly sickly and who's probably going to get discharged soon for losing his menial job at Brighton Fence and Wire and not even pretending to look for another one. The two have this bit they do on spaghetti night, where McDade comes into the living room right before chow and goes, "Some of that extra fine spaghetti tonight, Doonster?" And Dooney Glynn goes, "Ooh, will it be all lovely and soft?" And McDade goes, "Leave your teeth at home, boy," in the voice of a Kentucky sheriff, leading Glynn to the table by the hand, as if Glynn were a damaged child. They take care to do the bit while Gaitley's still in the kitchen, tossing salad and worrying about course presentation. Though Tiny Ewell never fails to thank Gaitley for the meal, and April Corlew is lavish in her praises, and Bert F. Smith always rolls his eyes with pleasure and makes yummy noises whenever he can get a fork to his mouth.